the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I are going to analyse how numerous countries have committed aid, intelligence expertise, military hardware, weapons to a multilateral effort in support of Ukraine. So what does this 2022 style of military diplomacy mean for the independent foreign policies of countries like New Zealand, with its style of incremental contributions and in aid of the defence of Ukraine? It's one of the primary questions we're going to be looking at. For example here, this week New Zealand government confirmed the deployment of a C-130 Hercules with 50 personnel to Europe. It committed also a further 8 logistics specialists based in Germany and $13 million in further support to procure equipment for the Ukraine military, and that's via the UK's military budget and weapon program and supplying Ukraine with defence. So that has raised a number of questions inside of New Zealand. On announcing the move, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said, and I quote here, "Our support is to assist the Ukraine army to repel a brutal Russian invasion because peace in the region of Europe is essential for global security," end of quote. But Ardern also added, and I quote once again, "The global response has seen an unprecedented amount of military support pledged for Ukraine, and more help to transport and distribute it is urgently needed, and so we will do our bit to help," New Zealand's Prime Minister Ardern said. So today, Paul and I will examine how Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with its method of total annihilation, has drawn once relatively independent nations into the fold of Western security alliances, and we will consider also whether such moves will become a permanent configuration. But also, and most significantly in this program, we'll look further afield to see connections and what this means. For example, in this episode, we are going to discuss the Southwest Pacific strategic balance, and specifically, why has the People's Republic of China and the Solomon Islands in the Western South Pacific, bilateral security arrangement between those two, why has that upset New Zealand, Australia and the United States of America? But before we deep dive into these main issues, remember, if you're joining us live, you can join us via the social media platforms and comment, and your comments will be able to be used in your interactions into this program. So let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who is waiting online to discuss these issues and a couple of other interesting twists. Good afternoon, Paul. Kia ora, and tēnā koe to you, e ho.
Buenas tardes, Don Selwyn. I've been reading Spanish. I'm returning to my roots and reading about Latin American politics. And as you know, I grew up in Argentina mostly, and so I'll tell you, it's wonderful to read in Spanish. It's such a beautiful language, and so buenas tardes just means good afternoon. It's not like I'm, becoming a Nobel laureate in the process. But I'm working on my 8-year-old. He's learning Terreo pretty good.
Yeah.
And there are similarities between Terreo and Spanish.
And what are they?
So,
what are those similarities?
The vowels. The vowels are pronounced the same way, a, e, I, o, u. Some of the F sounds, the WH turned to F, are similar and what have you. So he's got a little bit of a leg up both ways, because he learned a little bit of Spanish before he learned Terreo. But now he's fairly proficient in rudimentary Terreo. So he's schooling the old man. So I got to respond in Spanish.
That's seriously cool.
Yeah, and I try to throw him some loops sometimes by speaking in Portuguese, which I'm also lucky to speak, not as well as Spanish, and that gets him because he can figure out the Spanish, but Portuguese is close, but not the same. But anyway, good afternoon to you, and to our viewers and listeners. And yeah, when what prompted me to think about this week's show was, as you said, the New Zealand announcement that it's going to send about $13 million in aid. Now, $7.1 million of that is going to be a cash grant to the UK to purchase weapons. Now, that's an interesting wrinkle. That's that third party transfer stuff that I believe we've talked about in the past. And that's a way to get around sanctions. And I mean, to be honest, some of the unpleasant exports of military equipment from New Zealand to, let's say, Saudi Arabia and what have you have involved third party transfers. This is a variation on the theme, but it got me thinking about the broader picture, and which is, how do small states navigate military diplomacy at a time of transition marked by war? And here's the thing, Selwyn. I did a little research. As always with a research project, it starts out small. You think you have the answer, then you set to reading, and you're like, "Whoa, this is mushrooming out."
Yeah.
Check this out. So, who contributes to support for the Ukraine? Our prime minister said that the global community is firm in resisting this act of Russian aggression. And I should point out, Selwyn, just talking about learning curves, it had not occurred to me, and we have not talked about this, but the Soviets invaded Hungary in 1956 to put down a national rebellion. They invaded the Czechoslovakia in 1968 to do the same thing, and they did so successfully. So this invasion of Ukraine had precedents. I mean, I can't believe I didn't think about this early in our discussions. Their learning curve is that if they come in ruthlessly, they will succeed, and the status quo that they want will be maintained. I mean, we read the invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia as tragedies. They read them, that is, the Russians read them, as tremendous successes.
So this is all about understanding walking in the others. Yeah, the Russian mind, walking in the other's shoes.
Yeah, and I'll come back to this when, there's an interesting parallel we can make that many people may not have thought of when we start talking about the Solomons. But let me get back to who's contributing to the multilateral support for the Ukraine. And therein lies the rub. Small nations like New Zealand have to champion multilateralism because that allows us to do things that we can't do on our own. We're too small, too powerless. I mean, you know the whole thing. And so, my assumption was all small countries would at least give symbolic support, support the sanctions, condemn the Russians, that sort of thing. And here's what I find out. No Latin American country has contributed anything. That includes my beloved Argentina, but also Uruguay.
Well, it's an interesting thing you've raised there, Paul, because in the German news organisations, and I think it's representative across Europe, they're actually making a case for that overnight. They're saying that the Russian propaganda machine has been using populism to make sure that the populations of South America, or Latin America in particular, are not coming anywhere close to assisting the defence of Ukraine. So there's a lot more to be discussed about that and for something to come out, but I'm really interested to hear your position on this, Paul.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it real broad today. Maybe we can return on another event, because it's not just Latin America. I mean, of course, Bolsonaro in Brazil is a populist authoritarian. So, he sees, in fact, he was in Russia on the day of the invasion. I mean, that's how bad things are. But check this out. All of Africa, the entire Arab world, Israel, have not contributed a penny. All of Central Asia Southeast Asia, and East Asia, with the exception of Japan and Korea, have not contributed. The majority of the world has not contributed to this effort. So who did?
Yeah, is this
NATO.
why? Is this why? Because we discussed at length a few weeks ago as to what mechanism, what body should countries like New Zealand have access to assisting a resolution and such things. We were talking the United Nations through the United Nations frames from the General Assembly. Is this why countries like New Zealand have abandoned that route?
Well, it's interesting you say that because I think there is actually a simple answer to New Zealand. I think before I get to that, though, the broader issue is that the UN General Assembly has not issued a resolution encouraging countries to provide military support to the Ukraine. It's condemned the Russians. But absent that authorization, what appears to be going on is not strategic balancing, but strategic hedging on the part of big and small alike. I mean, India is straddling the fence. Pakistan is straddling the fence. Mexico is straddling the fence. So what we see supporting, and I'll call it just to be, not so funny, the coalition of the willing, is NATO members are all in, and they're giving weapons, they're giving humanitarian aid, all that. Finland and Sweden are in. They're not NATO members. France is in. It's not a NATO member. Turkey is in. They're supplying the drones, whose videos we are seeing because Turkey is a NATO member. And then it's the NATO partner countries. Who are they? Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Yeah. That's why we're contributing. We are NATO partners. The Australians have put $70 million, including ample lethal aid. And here's where it gets interesting in New Zealand, just to do a domestic aside. Once again, the Green Party has shown that it cannot be taken seriously on defense matters because after this announcement of the aid package, which is, again, $7.1 million in a cash transfer for basically small arms, and then the rest is dedicated to humanitarian aid, and we've already contributed humanitarian aid, but also to legal aid in the event, for the investigation and prosecution of war crimes. So I think, that balance is pretty good because before you get peace, you got to get the Russians to stop fighting. And the only way you're going to get to stop them from fighting is to make them realize that they will make no further battlefield gains. It's a strategic.
This is the argument that the National Party, the second largest party in the New Zealand Parliament, its spokesperson on foreign affairs, Jerry Brownlee, actually underscored a similar thing. He says, well, before you actually send aid in, you've got to help to get the aid there, and you need to defend the people that are under attack. So that in a few words is you've thrashed this out in a more robust kind of way, but that seemed to gel with the Labour Party. That's obviously the lead party in government here in New Zealand. The foes of the National Party on a pragmatic kind of juxtaposition of what. So you're criticising the Greens for ignoring the fact that Ukraine people actually need to be defended first and then assisted.
Yeah, and it follows our line. I mean, by the way, I have no time for Jerry Brownlee. He reads my tweets under the business name. So I've run a few of these lines out over the last week. So he read my tweets and ran with it. If it was up to Jerry Brownlee, we'd have tanks and be revisiting the spirit, of ANZUS and God knows what else. Now, the trouble is this. The Greens have come out and they criticize the government for sending money to purchase weapons. They did this knee-jerk pacifist thing and started squawking about humanitarian aid. And again, it riled me because, and I've been trolled quite a bit by so-called tankies and others who believe the Russian version of events. The Russians are the aggressors. You must stop the aggression. And you and I have talked about peacekeeping, peace enforcement, peacemaking, Peace enforcement involves making the aggressor stop. Then you bring in peacekeepers and what have you. Then you can provide humanitarian corridors. But if these guys are bombing refugee convoys and refugee centers and train stations, hospitals, and schools, unless you get them to stop, there is no place to provide humanitarian aid. So the naivete of the Greens to come out and criticize the government, I think serves them very poorly. I've urged over the years the Greens, within the realm of their pacifist orientation, to offer informed commentary about military security issues, and they refuse to do so. So, be that as it may, we were compelled to get involved because we are NATO partners. We support multilateralism. In fact, New Zealand is a champion of multilateralism, but, and this is the scary thing, we are in the minority, not the majority. Contrary to what the Prime Minister has said, the majority of the world is sitting on the fence, waiting for the outcome. And this gets to your original point. What is the strategic balance going to look after this war? And again, right now, there's a lot of strategic hedging going on. And as we've discussed tactically, there are three options. The Russians win, the Ukrainians win, or there's a strategic stalemate. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to win. I think their best bet is a strategic stalemate. But it's going to take a lot of armed convincing of the Russians to not press for victory, because that strategic balance will tilt towards Russia in the event that they win. The West will be in disarray because it did not respond, even with NATO sitting on the sidelines right there, to this act of aggression. So for people like us, we need that stalemate. I mean, if the Ukrainians can win and push the Russians out of the Donbass and, in and around Donetsk and what have you, that would be fantastic. But, to my mind, that's a pipe dream. I mean, that the Russians, I think, are there to stay. And you just have to convince them that they should be content with the gains that they made in East Ukraine. The South is still, it's still in dispute. And so we'll see how that goes. But the balance depends on the outcome. If Ukraine forces a stalemate, right, tie goes to, the weaker actor, then the balance, the pro-Western balance, will be reinforced. If the Russians win, that will embolden, as it said in your intro, authoritarians of all stripes. I've just come out of an almost week-long conversation with strategists about Taiwan and about how the Chinese are reading this. And I can't get into it, and I think that Taiwan is a different kettle of fish. But undoubtedly, if the Russians win, the Chinese, they may not take out military lessons from the affair, but they'll see that the West cannot respond. The West, even right there in Central Europe, they cannot respond effectively. And as I say, I've got a twist further on when we talk about the Solomons. So what I come away with is that, New Zealand really didn't have a choice. And then the question was how to finesse the provision of aid. And so what they did, remember, they started out with intelligence support, which I think you and I will agree is a lot more than what's been revealed in the signals realm. And I personally think that's good. Now, what they're doing is doing like a 60-40 split of humanitarian aid to indirect military aid when it comes to lethal weapons, and then direct military aid. Remember, New Zealand's providing helmets, flak jackets, body armor, that sort of thing. That's exactly what the South Koreans are providing, by the way. That's exactly what the Japanese are providing. It's just the South Koreans and Japanese are putting $100 million worth of aid into this multilateral coalition. We can't afford that, and so we put 13.1 at the latest count. that still leaves us with the conundrum of a world of fence straddlers, a world where places like, well, Costa Rica doesn't have a military, has a pacifist constitution, which incidentally Japan has as well. But I always think of my beloved Uruguay. And I'm like, you're small, you're going to be sit right under Brazil. You got Argentina across the river. Why wouldn't you do some sort of token support for this anti-aggression effort? And they won't. They're like, it's not our fight. And I'm like, but surely you understand that the shadow of the future hangs heavily over all of us right now. If the Russians win, our future is going to be dark. That to me, and you can say, well, you're a Yank, you're pro-American. I'm like, this was a unprovoked unilateral aggression on a sovereign state. And we'll talk about sovereignty soon enough. And whatever the Russians' justifications and what have you, the point is they went in and they're now, waging a war of annihilation under the rubric of denazification in the regions that they're disputing or which are under their control. That's the bottom line. I mean, there's a spin that the Ukrainians, are doing this and there's crisis actors and all of that. I mean, it's rubbish. Okay, it's absolute rubbish.
I'll just pick up a couple of things. So we've got quite a lot of commentary that's been coming in. One of the ones I'd like to bring in is coming in from Liz Hughes. Just before I do so, there's a couple of things. The Germans, for example, are starting to define New Zealand's contribution, Australia's contribution, within the cloak of the Five Eyes Alliance. And the kind of, you can see how New Zealand's case is based largely around the UK, Britain's contribution to the defence of Ukraine for various means. And you can see that incrementalism, as we've discussed prior to the program, with respect to New Zealand dovetailing in with that effort. But the significant thing is they're not talking about the Five Eyes partnership, the NATO partnership that countries like New Zealand and Australia have, but the Five Eyes elements. Now, whether or not there's a bit of lag operationally, and they've defined it as such from the point of view of the intelligence contributions that countries like Australia and New Zealand have made, maybe there. But getting back to the main thrust of this part relating to the strategic alliance and the merits of it or otherwise, Liz Rumswell Hughes has put a question in here. I just put a statement really back on screen, and I'll read it out here. And she makes a point, and seems to be represented by many in New Zealand that are very vocal, and she says, many of us are terrified of a disastrous nuclear war between nuclear partners, Paul. And I guess I would add to that with respect to nuclear threat and nuclear risk, I think the deterrence thing in my mind is very simple. It only works when you have two stable opponents rationalising the principles of deterrence. If Putin gets to a point where the Western groupings thrust upon him enough pressure that he does feel that he's the rat that's cornered, do those threats that he has made, whether they be tactical or otherwise, become a realisation? And I guess that's what Liz is talking about. It may be worth responding to that. And she also, for those that are on Facebook, Liz has put in a link to the Stuff website where Matt Robson, a former cabinet minister in the Labour Alliance government and significantly Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, and has made a career out of human rights, is also arguing from the point of view of a claim, is New Zealand back under the nuclear umbrella? And what he's talking about is, has New Zealand's government's decisions placed New Zealand at risk of abandoning its principles and its legislation of denuclearisation around the world? So, Paul, I just wanted to add those things in at this juncture so that we're not just reading them in retrospective things at the end.
No, good. And welcome and hello to Liz. And thanks for joining the show. You're always a valuable contributor. Liz, what I would say is this. If chemical weapons are used, right? There's two different paths here. If chemical weapons are used, there will be no nuclear exchanges. The idea for military planners, strategic planners, you try to calibrate escalation and you try to contain escalation within the tactical environment that is operative. So if there's chemical weapons involved, because now there's banter about it, I discount the claims that the Russians have already used chemical weapons because that came from the Azov battalion. And they've also made some other extravagant claims. Not that I'm any friend of the Russians, but I would say we should discount what the Azov battalion has to say because they do want to draw NATO into this war. And so I don't think that the Russians have used them yet. Maybe they will. But if that's the case, we won't see any nukes. The response will be conventional. It won't be in kind. And we'll see if that's successful in getting those attacks to stop. Now, many New Zealanders, and I think Selwyn and I did a show a year and a half ago, where we decided to do a little bit of a primer on nuclear strategy because many New Zealanders still believe that mutual assured destruction is the strategic doctrine operative at this very moment. It is not. The doctrine is flexible response. It's been in place since the 1970s. We now have the technologies to deploy nukes from the tactical level, let's say out of an artillery shell, to the strategic level, ICBMs. And the reason for that was to give military commanders discretion to not go all or nothing. The idea was if you can get a low yield artillery fired nuke that would take out an enemy position before you're overwhelmed, that would be better than doing nothing and losing. But it also puts the fear of nukes into everybody's mind because then you start thinking, okay, I've released this genie out of this bottle. And it's a small wee genie, but now the big guy could be further down the road. Putin's threats, I think, refer to battlefield nukes. Battlefield nukes, not only in the Ukraine, but if the Russians start losing, they're hinting that they might have to resort to nukes against NATO for the support being given. And I'm not terrified at this point, but yes, I am very fearful that we could see this escalate into tactical nuclear warfare. Selwyn made a very good point. If Putin is cornered like a rat and his dreams of creating a new Russian empire are dashed, then all bets are off. That depends on the command and control system of his strategic nukes. But there's another part to flexible response, which is this. MAD, it's assumed, would target cities. You would target what are known as high-value targets. Cities. You kill cities. Now, to kill a city with a nuke is actually very rudimentary. You don't need a lot of technology to kill cities with nukes. But even as of the 70s, the emphasis shifted to killing hard targets, command and control bunkers. The United States has a whole military complex in the Rocky Mountains under NORAD, I think it's called. But anyway, a series of huge caves and stuff. The only way to kill that is with not one, but a few nukes. So the idea was you start killing hard targets and you hold the cities hostage because you're going to have to negotiate with someone, even if they're glowing. And so since the 70s, we've had in Russia, in the UK, and in the United States, less so India and Pakistan because of their rivalry, and they don't have the arsenals that these other countries have. But even the French, who are a nuclear power, understand you target hard targets. You want to kill off their command, control, computing intelligence, and military capability. Then you negotiate with the civilians who are left, to pick up the rubble. That's why I don't think we're going to escalate into Armageddon over this particular war. But that depends
the
on
problem on this, and with huge respect here, Paul, is on the basis of risk analysis and also trying to understand the decision making within the Russian Federation prior to invasion. Both you and I argued persuasively that we didn't believe, under that set of information that was coming out in data sets and values, the whole thing, that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. My concern is that we do not yet understand this opponent and how his mind ticks, in the same way that it took all of us some time to understand the irrationality of Donald Trump as President of the United States, to the point where, as we understand, it was very, very, very tense, and some scary realities could have come out of the United States preemptive decisions under Trump in the last months of his presidency. So I get back to that point. I'm sorry, but I don't apologise, but I get back to that point that these arguments, these issues relating to the sophistications of deterrence, which many would argue has held the line for decades now in the world, that when a person is cornered, it is simply, or ill-informed, or whatever people is the realities within the Kremlin at the moment, that the danger is elevated until such time as that danger is relaxed. Does that kind of make sense, Paul?
Yeah. Oh, no, it makes perfect sense. I mean, the hard fact is that if the Russians start to lose and Putin's objectives are not achieved, and again, you and I have talked about this, you got to leave the defeated side or the frustrated side, you got to leave them an honorable out. You've got to give them an exit strategy where they save face. And I sure hope the Ukrainians and NATO are thinking about this. But the deal also involves something we've talked about, which is, believe it or not, the Russian command and control over nuclear weapons is better than that of the United States. Why? In the United States, the president makes the call. He has the nuclear codes. Let's say he pushes the button, and the signal goes to every submarine sitting deep in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. It goes directly to the missile silos, and they have no choice. They do the double key switch, and they light up the world.
And unless
In
the
Russia,
United States military does the world a favour and looks at its president and thinks, it's no longer equipped with the sanity to be able to make such a decision. And we understand that there's been 2 times at least that's been involved.
Exactly. Thank goodness for cool heads.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Now, in Russia, it turns out that the executive branch makes the call, but the nuclear forces command center, there's a whole military, unit known as the nuclear forces or the missile forces. Their commanders can veto the Kremlin's call. And that
do we know enough of those individuals? Do we understand the thinking, the training, the backgrounds, the rationale that exists within those bodies to satisfy the West that deterrence is still alive and well?
No, we don't not. It's pretty opaque. But in my time dealing with the Pentagon types, and in turn they're dealing with adversaries of various sorts, in some regards, particularly with regards to nuclear weapons, because they're relatively modern phenomena, there's some symmetry in the perspectives of the commanders. Now, we don't know for sure if either the brass at in missile command, or, and here's the thing, there's a third veto point, which is the people who actually are in control of the missiles themselves. So the order goes from the Kremlin to Missile Command, then down to the sea-based and land-based nuclear fleets. Air-based fleets, they'll be knocked out of the sky before they arrive at their targets. So 2 legs of the triad are the ones that you can't kill off preemptively. And so then it becomes a matter of who the commanders are and their training. My understanding, I've spent a lot more time in the last 6 months reading about Russian military history and Russian operational structures, is that they tend to be the creme de la creme of certainly the land-based forces. Submariners the world around are the creme de la creme of their navies. Almost goes without saying. But they tend to put their best and brightest into the in control of their missile systems, in part because of the consequences of deploying nukes in a real war. So I think, again, getting back to Liz, who I respect her opinion, although it's clear we differ, is that I think that the commanders will pause if Putin gives them the order to start nuking within Ukraine. And they will give a lot of pause to expanding the nuclear conflict outside of Ukrainian borders. So, having said that, then the shoe is on the other foot. What is NATO going to do if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons in the Ukraine? And I'll be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know, but I'm inclined, I really mean this. I'm inclined to say they're not going to do anything. They will be so afraid that we will have an escalation into strategic nuclear exchanges that even if the Russians use battlefield nuclear weapons, which is a distinct possibility, I think they will try to support Ukraine via conventional means.
So what that suggests to me is the slippery slope of tactical nukes in a real war theatre, that deterrence has already failed in that respect. If you're correct on that, then the whole argument of deterrence falls into the gutter. That the only last bastion that deterrence as a philosophy has, or an effective means of containing security, only rests on the last line of the MAD doctrine, if I so rudely would put it that way. That response from me is obviously designed to solicit a response from you, Paul. What do you say to that?
Well, again, don't use the phrase "mad." Okay, that's gone. It's gone.
Yeah, but you get my point without dissecting the label. That large strategic big bang bombs of nuclear warfare is your last perimeter of defence, your last perimeter of security. If you're no longer able to deter, and we're getting into theories and suppositions of security strategies here, but if that is no longer able to be deterred through the conventional deterrence means, that if Putin is able to feel he can get away with deploying tactical nuclear weapons onto Ukrainian battlefields, and my fear is that the withdrawal from Kiev and the western sides of Ukraine clears the way potentially for that type of thing to occur, then the only level of defence, I'll say it once again, the only perimeter of security defence that is left is the big nuclear bang bombs of which the world has never seen before.
Well, I'll just have to disagree. I think that
But I don't understand why you wouldn't agree with that. The logic is very firm.
Well, again, the nature of deterrence depends on the enemy and the context. The Ukraine is not a NATO member. So it's not as if Russia is attacking NATO with nuclear weapons. If it does that, there will be a nuclear response. And that's where the Russians are deterred. The Russians know what will be coming their way, because NATO is not going to respond to Russia in the Ukraine. It will go after targets in Russia. And so, the Russians, I think of the military commanders I've met over the years, and they do think about their children. They do think about their children's future. And as a result, no one wants a nuclear war because you're right in this respect. You don't know where it's going. I mean, if you get a madman at, let's say, the mid-range tactical level, then the escalation potential into strategic exchanges is high.
Yeah.
So I think what happens is the Ukraine is not NATO, and because of that, the automatic response is not guaranteed. That's why I say I wonder if NATO would make a move of a nuclear sort if the attacks were confined to Ukraine. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, I don't think NATO is coming with a nuke to their rescue. Now,
Although we have seen rhetoric on that point coming out in previous weeks, where it was made, in my view, very clear that if there was an escalation from Russia with respect to chemical, biological, or nuclear weaponry, then that becomes a regional conflict. It's not contained within Ukraine. So that argument, I guess, is pushing a deterrence line, of course. We're getting back to a situation where we're looking at, well, if he does deploy potentially tactical nuclear weapons, the low yield weapons in the Ukraine theatre, then that does not regionalise this aggression. That does not send a tripwire of deterrence response, a retaliatory response on behalf of those countries that are wrapped around NATO. I just am not yet convinced on that. But Paul, we are robust enough to agree to disagree on these things.
yeah. I mean, it's. I'll tell you what, though, you and I are watching the making of history in this regard, because never, they say the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has raised the threshold to 90 seconds before midnight. Midnight meaning total nuclear war. We're watching the testing of modern deterrence theory as we speak. This disagreement we're having is exactly that. We're sounding out, different hypotheticals to what is maybe coming at us, but which is at present unknown. So I'm enjoying it. I mean, I think if everybody stops and takes a breath and says, if you use a nuke, we're going to have Armageddon. I feel a lot better about that, quite frankly, because the Russians will get that message. No, I should say one other thing. And I'm not going to say that this is par for the course, but it is known that in times of increased real tension, military commanders will reach out to their adversarial counterparts without the knowledge of the political leadership. It's like in the spy business, some secrets are too important to allow politicians to know them. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are hotlines established, not only with Russian missile commanders, but with Chinese missile commanders and those of the United States in particular, perhaps other countries in the West. And that they would talk and say, under what circumstances do you feel that you have no choice but to use, in this instance, a tactical nuke or a theater nuke? And sort of talk it out and say, well, we won't do this if you don't do that. In the middle of a conflict, just say, what are your thresholds? What are ours? I saw a mini version of this when I worked in the Pentagon on a much minor issue, which involved Cuba. And I happened to accompany people from the Southern Command in a third country who talked with Cuban military commanders about potential scenarios that should be avoided. And the Castro brothers didn't know about these meetings. So the people we talked to were at great risk. But the idea was to give mutual assurances that under no circumstances would, we do this, they do that. Well, the stakes are a lot bigger here. And so I would imagine that some of the bigger players in uniform, who are actually the guys who are going to fire these nuclear weapons, are having discrete conversations, even if it's through third or fourth parties, to diminish the possibility that nuclear weapons will be employed in the first instance by anyone. Now, again,
Yeah, but my point here is that we do not know that, and your admission is that within the Russian Federation, those bodies that you're alluding to there, that we don't have an understanding of the way they think, the cultures of structure, or the authoritarian command structures within those bodies. So therefore, it is opaque. And I rest on the argument that when deterrence works, it only works when you've got a reasonable circumstance, a reasonable rationale that develops in the case of projecting out what will happen if this happens. And when that is broken, whether it be through the pressures on an authoritarian leader or otherwise, then the deterrence becomes moot. And this is where my concerns relating to whether or not deterrence is going to work in any way with respect to tactical nukes, or is that slippery slide lead toward the last bastion of defence and a realisation of that? But Paul, we've got to get to our other topic, and you and I can probably take our positions relating to this to the grave, pardon the pun. But let's explore this. For example, it is connected. We've talked extensively about earlier in this episode about whether or not it's a new normal for relatively independent foreign policy countries like New Zealand within the context of leaning west and being a part of the various Western alliances. Whether or not this is the new normal of engagement, that the independence through the multilateralism system, through the United Nations, for example, to test whether or not a country like New Zealand would respond. And I would argue even Japan in this context, which is obviously not a small country. That it has its testing grounds in other parts of the world, to put it quite frankly. And there's been this issue that many in New Zealand and Australia and in the wider Western South Pacific have been embracing, where the Solomon Islands and the People's Republic of China have developed a bilateral security arrangement that basically gives the Solomons choice, should the problems on its own soil develop at any one stage. And just as a very quick backgrounder to this, the Solomon Islands back in around 2003, there was civil unrest that happened for a multitude of reasons. And the Solomon Islands agreed by the signing of a non-aggression pact at Townsville in Australia, and I was witness to this at the time, where the leaders of Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and a number of others from the Pacific agreed that they would send troops that afternoon, armed troops, to settle the unrest that was occurring in Honiara and the wider Solomon Islands. That non-aggression pact was to sign to satisfy the leadership, the government of the Solomon Islands, that it wasn't a takeover or an invasion. And that was called the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, or RAMSES, as we all talk about it. When the Australians and New Zealanders respond to the Chinese making a move strategically down in the southwestern Pacific by a bilateral security arrangement, then that starts to unsettle countries. Now, Paul, that's the backdrop. I just wanted to take that burden of describing the backdrop off you, and let's respond to why has China and the Solomon Islands done this, and why has Australia, New Zealand and the United States become so upset about it? Is it linked, for example, to the happenings in Europe at this time?
Yeah, it is. But let me get to the first. I'll deal with the Chinese and the Solomons. The Chinese, obviously, as part of their rise to great power status, want to engage in power projection to protect their interests, sea lanes of communication, and the like, as you do, as you're an emerging great power. And they've been looking for forward basing rights for a long time throughout the Pacific, even as far as Argentina. Remember, they have a signals collection station in Argentine Patagonia, which is clearly used for military purposes. They did that commercially, and they've reneged a bit on the promises of, not using it for security and all that, but it's a done deal. They've been looking for bases. Everyone thought that they would eventually get a forward base in Suva because of the deep water port. They make port visits to Suva all the time, both gray hulls, and then they have a semi-permanent stationed hospital ship, which seems to go nowhere, as it turns out, but which is there because it's a deep draft ship and that justifies keeping the dredging going in the port on the part of Chinese companies. About 2 years ago, 18 months ago, there was discussion of the Chinese opening a base in Vanuatu at an old Allied naval and air base there, and immediately the Australians and the United States signed a lease agreement to develop that base, something they hadn't even talked about until the Chinese expressed interest. So the bilateral between the Solomon Islands and the PRC involves two components. One is Chinese police trainers are now on the ground. They've in fact started training 2 weeks ago, doing things like crowd control, small arms, marksmanship, things that you might raise an eyebrow at, but are in fact the things that Ramsey did. And then there are still New Zealand and Australian police trainers doing the same thing. So they're doing no more than what Ramsey did and what the traditional allies are doing now. The part of that component that worries people is that the language of the police element is that the police will also, these Chinese police, if needed, will defend Chinese investment in the Solomons. Well, Chinese investment in the Solomons is the biggest investment in the Solomons.
Yeah, no, just underscore the importance of what Paul has just said there. And sorry to interject, but you pick up from where you left. Was in 2019, for example, Solomon Islands' engagement with Taiwan interests in its territorial waters and territorial authority, if you like, I'm going to put it that way, changed and shifted toward the People's Republic of China's interests. And what happened there was a spark of civil unrest, of arsons that occurred in Honiara. Buildings that were targeted were Chinese-owned buildings. And it seemed that there was a clash between the Taiwanese interests and the Chinese interests here. So that is an important element relating to the security arrangements that are occurring there. For example, in a very small scale, is this basically, Paul, that kind of thing, the front end of a proxy war between Taiwan and China in a sense, albeit through civil unrest?
Well, the evolution of the switch of recognition from Taiwan to the PRC was basically fueled by PRC investment in the Solomons. And let's be very clear, not all Solomon Islanders are happy with that switch in recognition, hence the riots, nor are they happy with this new bilateral security agreement. So there's that whole domestic side. This is not going over well with particularly the Malaysians.
Yeah, people from Malacca as opposed
right,
to
Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
So, but here's the thing: the shopkeeper class in the Solomon Islands tend to be ethnic Chinese, but these are small business owners. These are part of the larger Chinese diaspora. The investment that people are worried about in terms of having Chinese policemen protect them are the large investors, people who are coming in. Again, logging is now a major percentage of GDP. It's totally controlled by the Chinese. They are building ports ostensibly for tourism. So the concern is that now you will have Chinese police defending Chinese interests in the Solomons. That strikes some people as a slippery slope. On the other hand, the military component is basically about regular port visits to Honiara to resupply. Now, let me say something about hypocrisy here. In New Zealand, in Auckland and Wellington, we get regular visits by Chinese naval vessels and intelligence collection vessels. Regular. Every 6 to 9 months, we get a visit by a Chinese warship of one sort or another. So I would say, what's the difference? And here's where things, I think, where the hypocrisy does matter. The Russians justify invading Ukraine because Ukraine, a sovereign nation, dared to indulge a foreign policy that was not of the Russians' liking. Well, yesterday, the head of whatever foreign affairs committee there is in the Australian Senate, to a chorus of cheerleading from the Australian media, threatened the Solomon Islands if they went ahead with an independent sovereign decision to sign the security agreement with the PRC. What is the difference between the warnings Russia gave about Ukraine flirting with NATO and the threats that Australia is now making openly towards the Solomons because they want port visits from the PRC?
I think
I
it
would say,
tests that principle that you've laid out in previous episodes very clearly, that where there's a descending power situation, there are responses that can be akin to invasion and war. And I would suggest that if Australia's fears are real and the People's Republic of China is establishing an outreach base militarily into the Pacific, and Australia is pushed back into its box and it is no longer the regional power in the area, it's in decline, and such things come out of its parliament that would suggest instability of security in the region. I would just put that theory back to you in that respect. Perhaps that's part of the answer in a theoretical sense.
it is part of the answer because, if you have the displacing of, traditional patrons, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States by the Chinese in the event that a forward basing agreement. See, the fear is that these port visits are going to become a permanent presence in the form of a forward operating base, naval base. Naval bases inevitably come with airstrips. That'll be, the leg hold, not just the toehold that the Chinese have in the Southwest Pacific. New Zealand is on board with the Australians. We're just a little more diplomatic about our concerns. But you just nailed it. It's a geopolitical wrestle. Now, the Australians and the New Zealand foreign ministries will tell you this is about values. The traditional patrons are democratic and adhere to democratic values. The Chinese are authoritarian and don't give a whit about democratic values. I would simply say that's rubbish. Australia and New Zealand, quite frankly, I don't think are very concerned about the nature of domestic politics in the Solomons, so long as the politics of the Solomon is friendly towards the West. I think that's it, realpolitik. But you know what? There's another condescending element here. And again, I'm not a fan of the Chinese precisely because they're authoritarian. But in the middle of this, but which has been superseded, is the Melanesian Spearhead Group. That was supposed to be the regional security organization, not Australia, not New Zealand, but Melanesians themselves,
Well,
headquartered
it'll be interesting from the point of view of the MSG, as we call it here, the Melanesian Spearhead Group, and politically how it positions itself at the Pacific Island Forums in 2022. That's where it has been most effective, where we've seen much of the debate about engaging with Australia and New Zealand and the rest of the wider South Pacific on issues of security. So it'll be fascinating to see exactly what takes shape there, Paul, with respect to the MSG. Any information as to where it is sitting with respect to the Chinese Solomon Islands developments?
No, but that's the interesting thing. And a lot of this is, the dog barking after the rubbish truck has left. I say that because the MSG has been very silent. It's headquartered in Fiji, in Suva. Fiji has embraced what is known as a looking north foreign policy, where it has looked away from its traditional partners and is now looking to Russia and China as foreign policy interlocutors, including the supply of weapons. So the Solomons is not the first Pacific country to embrace the Chinese. And of course, if the Chinese get a base in the Solomons and then establish a base in Fiji, they're controlling strategic waterways in the water between them. That's what the geopolitical, the Anglophone geopolitical analysts are concerned about. Again, for the Solomon Islands and for the Fijians before them, they simply may not share the notion that Western democracies are good allies, that Western democracies, that their aid, developmental and otherwise, always comes conditioned with Western values attached, Western, demands for transparency and the like. Again, you and I may say, yeah, that's good, but it's for the Fijians and the Solomon Islanders to determine what's in their best interest. They may get burnt. I mean, they may get burnt by the Chinese and or the Russians down the road, but it's for them. If you believe in sovereignty, right, then you believe that it's their right to make the decision without being threatened. And
So
we're not doing that.
In a way, it's kind of underscored the fact that the West, in this case, is underlined by New Zealand and Australia's engagement on this, hasn't learnt the hypocrisy angles yet. That if the call from those peace groups within New Zealand, that the hypocrisy of the West with respect to Ukraine is an absolute cancer on the world's stability in the past and no doubt would be in the future. These kind of things with respect to the Australia and New Zealand's response to Solomon Islands on China, I guess I'm just taking and building an argument from what you've just said, is that no one has learnt anything with respect to a line in the sand and keeping, well, in simple terms, keeping on message.
Right. I mean, let me start simply by saying that just because particularly Western powers have gotten away with crimes against humanity and war crimes in the past does not mean that we can justify Russian war crimes and crimes against humanity now. All right. Hopefully, we have learned through the Nuremberg trials and everything that followed that you can't leave this stuff unpunished. And as we've said before, if someone can go and place Henry Kissinger under arrest and drag him to the ICC to put him on trial for his crimes, I'd welcome it. He, Benjamin Netanyahu, was under indictment. I'm for it. But let's just concentrate on the here and now. And therein lies the rub with regards particularly to New Zealand. I don't expect any different from the Australians, because the Australians are going to become the American mini-me. They're going to bully. They're going to do all the things the Yanks did, and then some.
Within the region, they're often referred to as the United States' deputy sheriff on the wild blue Pacific.
You can see it. New Zealand, I'm thinking, we talk a lot about sovereignty. We talk a lot about multilateralism. And then we react in a knee-jerk, visceral fashion to the fact that the Chinese get to have port visits. Now, I would simply say, if the MSG issues a statement of concern about the potential for Chinese bases in the Solomons, saying, among other things, that the hope was always to see that the Southwest Pacific would be effectively demilitarized, that it would not become a region of great power competition, and therefore move from being a peripheral strategic area to a shatter zone, then, I'm thinking, okay, now we've got the word from those who will be directly impacted by the Chinese presence. And let's remember, there's a French military presence.
I was just going to say that. I was just going to, and you'll pick up on it. I was going to say New Zealand executive government's position via the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is simply New Zealand simply does not want to see the militarisation of the Pacific. But that happened years ago with the French presence in the Pacific, albeit in French Polynesia and around the equator areas of the Pacific, but it's been in existence for many, many decades. So, Paul, can you speak to that point and then we'll wrap up?
Okay, well, I mean, you're right. The de facto militarization has been here for a long time. If we just start thinking about, the Australian presence, but American bases in Australia. Again, the French have 5,000 troops in New Caledonia. That's where the French Pacific Air Force is headquartered. So they're there. The trouble, I guess, is that those are traditional allies and Westerners. It's the presence of a non-Western authoritarian adversary that has everybody upset. And I would say, yes, from our value systems, and I liked your comment about hard geopolitics, descendant versus ascendant. From a hard geopolitical point of view, and from a values point of view, the establishment of a permanent Chinese base in the Solomons is worrisome for the current status quo. But from the perspective of Melanesians, Solomon Islanders, Fijians, and the rest of the Pacific Island Forum, they may not have the concerns that we do. They may see the Chinese have been very generous so far with their development aid, and they don't attach strings to it. So you may say, well, this is short-sighted. You're going to pay for this in the end, one way or another. But again, that is for them to figure out. Now, I would imagine, and this is why I say there's lots of condescension and more than a hint of racism, is that if you say to me, hypothetically speaking, oh no, but these people don't know what is about to happen to them. They're incapable of understanding the bigger play. I would say, either you believe in independence in foreign policy and the sovereignty of nations. And if you believe in democracy, let's be honest, the United States is proof that idiots can vote a president into office. I mean, if you really want to go down that way, it's not about lack of knowledge, lack of intelligence and all that. It's about the sovereign independent rights of nations to chart their own destinies for better or worse. And so I find that a lot of the barking from the sidelines in Australia and New Zealand, to a lesser extent the United States, because I really think that outside of strategic circles, no one in the United States gives a damn. I think that that barking is ill-considered. The warnings have been given. The Solomon Islanders, the government of the Solomon Islanders has clearly been apprised of the potential downside of a permanent agreement with the Chinese. Let them make their decisions without being coerced into one position or another.
Thank you for that, Paul. Thanks for the comment that you've made. The contribution is excellent, and also the debate. For those who have joined us live, thank you for that. And for those that are listening to it, it might be worth going to the Facebook presence of this particular podcast and seeing some of the debate that has been going on in the comments area. We've brought up on screen, for those that are listening, a number of times some of the comments that are there. It's certainly a clash between two viewpoints on how things should be handled on a global and regional platform or theatre, if I should put it that way. But thanks again for your attendance to this episode, and we look forward to bringing you another episode of A View from Afar at this time next week. Until then, do stay safe and take care. Goodbye.